JMC 6000 here, and as you just saw, I just pulled in the 89 Buick Riviera, and what I wanted to do in this video is talk about one thing, and that's this beauty underneath the hood. The 3800 Series 1, technically Series 1, Buick V6. Now let's talk about it. Let's kind of find out, and what I want to discuss in this video on why they named this V6, whether it be the Series 1, the Series 2, or even the Series 3, an absolute indestructible, durable, reliable engine. And I believe it comes down to three things. And we're going to talk about those three things here in this video. But first, let's give a little background of where the 3800 came from. Now, there's many stories and different things written up about the 3800, but essentially, this engine has its roots dated all the way back to the 60s when Buick needed a smaller V6 to have in their smaller vehicles to kind of compete with some different things. And what they did was they took their Fireball V8 and it basically locked off two cylinders, and essentially the 3800 or the 3.8 liter was born. In fact, it was known differently back then as the Dauntless 225. And later on, Buicks didn't see a need to keep the V6 around, so they sold their design to Jeep. And so Jeep actually used this generation of used an earlier generation of this V6 in the old CJs. In fact, you can get an old CJ. I've worked on an old CJ that actually had a version of this Buick V6 in it. Then the fuel crisis hit in the mid-70s. Stuff started to be downsized. People were concerned about emissions. And Buick was like, you know what? We want that V6 back. We want the design back. So they bought it back from Jeep. Came out to be the 225. And then they later on made some different iterations, different visions, revisions of this V6. In the 80s, it was known as a 3.8 liter. And what made this V6 famous was when Buick dropped it in the Regal, slapped a turbo on it in I believe it was 79. And that's when the first turbocharged version of this 3.8 started to come about. And then, of course, the famous Grand National, the Buick Regal T-Types, the 3.8 that was turbo with sequential port fuel injection that was intercooled, and then of course the GNX that produced close to 300 horsepower out of it was unheard of at the time in the 80s, out of a small displacement, 3.8 liter V6. So this particular engine dates its lineage back to the front wheel drive. So basically Buick had two versions of the V6. Had the rear-wheel drive 3.8 that you found in the Regal and in many other vehicles, different ones. And then they had a transverse mounted, also known as a 3.8. It was actually called the Red Top V6 because it had a little red V6 logo and Buick logo right on the top of the intake. Red dot, rather, V6. Anyway, that was a 3.8. You can always tell the older generation 3.8s because the valve covers actually had 3 bolts. 1, 1, 1. That actually held the valve cover on. They were done with those bolts. Anyway, so in 1988, the 3800 was born. They basically took the 90-degree cast iron block heads, which we're going to talk about, and they turned it into the 3800 that we know and love. And this was the first generation, the first series iteration of this V6 that is actually found in this 89 Buick Riviera. So let's talk about what made this V6 famous and why it's known as an indestructible, in fact, one of the best engines GM has ever produced, whether it be the Series 1, the Series 2, or even the Series 3 that was introduced in 04. So let's talk about it. Number one, I believe it comes down to three things. The first thing is durability, or how should I put it, reliability. And actually it goes back to how the engine is built, how it's durable. And you may like, what do you mean by that? Well, the premise of this V6, whether it was introduced in 88 all the way up to its last iteration in 04, always had a cast iron block, cast iron head, and they always use a simple 12-valve overhead valve design. Now, later iterations actually had roller rockers. This particular one is actually a fulcrum type where it actually has a center stud in where the rocker pivots to kind of dictate how it opens up and closes the valves. This particular engine, when it came out, was actually introduced with a roller lifter and a roller camshaft to operate those roller lifters. So pretty neat design. This particular engine how durable it is because just how, what makes this engine durable is not only the cast iron block and heads, but also the cast aluminum one-piece intake manifold, the tubular steel exhaust system, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit, and just the way the overall, how it looks, how compact it is, and just a basic premise. It's what made the LS, what made the old 350s, what made the LS really indestructible and really good V8s is what was baked into this V6. So first off, again, number one, I would have to say would be durability and how the engine is built. Very basic design. The crankshaft itself is cast iron with what they call a split pin design. So on most V8s, the two rods, like 1 and 2, they actually share the same crankshaft pin, or yes, on the same pin, or on the same journal rather. It's not split, it's the same journal. On V6s, you have to actually split the design in order to get an even firing V6, so this thing can fire at 120-degree intervals. In fact, they make odd fire and even fire V6s. Buick, the older 225 Dauntless, was an odd fire V6, where the two lining up pistons, whether it be this one and this one, all shared the same crank pin like on a V8. The only problem that was they were known to vibrate. Oh my goodness, they vibrated because they fired unevenly. One would fire 120, and then the other one would be 90, and then the other one would be 120. It was just an uneven firing order, which caused the engine a lot of vibration. So inherently 90-degree V6s vibrate anyway, but in order to smooth them out, they had to split the crank pin, and that's what they did with this V6. Not only did they split the crank pin, but they also added a balance shaft that was not just chain driven, but it was gear to gear driven off the camshaft. So again, very durable in its design. That balance shaft helped to really make this engine buttery smooth, even when it's resting on idle, all the way up to its red line of about 5 or 5,500 RPMs. Buttery smooth. So let's talk about the other thing that makes this V6 indestructible. It is simplicity. Simplicity. So as you can tell, this V6 doesn't have a lot of wires running around, doesn't have a lot of vacuum hoses. In fact, you have these vacuum hoses right here with this vacuum block, and that's pretty much it. Let me go through some of the sensors this V6 has. It has a crankshaft position sensor that actually lets the ECU know with 2 signals, lets the ECU know with an 18x position that lets the ECU know the RPMs, and a 3x crankshaft signal position that actually lets the ECU know when the number 1 and number 4 cylinder come up for fire, to basically tell the computer when to fire the spark plugs, and also how to work the fuel injection. Part of it, how to work the fuel injection. If either one of those signals are interrupted, the engine will possibly die, or it will stay running, but it will not be able to restart. Kind of interesting. Also, this engine has a camshaft position sensor. That sensor controls the sequential fuel injection. If I take this cover off here, just like that, we see the fuel injectors, the one-piece manifold, and we see the individual fuel injectors. Now, when the engine is cold, this fires in what we call a batch fire or multi-port fuel injection firing system. Basically, it will fire one side, all 3 injectors, and then the other side, and then it will alternate until the engine comes up to temperature and it comes down to a certain RPM. Once that happens, it reads where the camshaft is in relation to cylinder number 1, and then that's where it can also fire the injectors individually. So it'll do, this one, all when the intake valves are open right at the moment. That's why it's sequential versus multi-port. Usually multi-port engines are batch fire fuel injection. Sequential fuel injection engines actually fire sequentially when each intake valve is open. You get better fuel efficiency, you get a smoother running engine, and also one of the nice things about this engine that it gets amazing fuel economy. But before we go there, simplicity. This engine is very simplistic. Again, wires, you have it for each fuel injector. Besides the camshaft and the crankshaft position sensor on the throttle body side, everything is embedded into one area right here. So you have a MAV sensor, which is called the mass airflow sensor. That senses how much air is actually flowing into the engine as the throttle plate opens and closes. You have a throttle position sensor, which is right here. That lets the computer know how much gas you're giving it, how much the throttle is open. Also, on this particular engine, you also have an idle air control valve. It's on the underside of the throttle body, and that actually, what it dictates is the idle speed of the engine. Since this engine has a mechanical throttle linkage, it can't vary the throttle position, or it cannot vary the throttle plate unless your foot's on it. So in order to control the idle air, it uses an idle air control valve. Also, one of the last things this engine has for sensors, again, very simplistic, you have a EGR valve, which is right here, with 3 different EGR position openings. That's all electronic, solenoid based. So if one of the solenoids go, and actually throw a check engine code and let you know, if one of the solenoids go, you have to replace a whole EGR valve, which I actually recently did on this engine. Was able to get it for under $100. And then finally, this engine has a right here, this wire here goes to the oxygen sensor. It only has one oxygen sensor, and what that does, it lets the engine or the ECU know how to adjust the air-fuel ratio via the ejectors, and also via how the throttle plate is opened or closed. For ignition, which is so cool with this engine does not have a distributor. Unlike older engines, whether it be the old Chevy 350 or old 351 Fords or 302s, even at this time period, this engine is distributorless ignition, where it uses a single coil pack, and also underneath that coil pack, it has what they call an IDS, Ignition Distributor System, or an Ignition Control Module, an ICM. So what that does is that tells the computer when to fire each of the batch of cylinders, and it's called wasted spark ignition. So as it fires 1 and 4, it may be up for just firing 1 cylinder, but 4 be wasted, or 2 and 6, or 3 and 6, or 2 and 4, or whatever the case may be. It's kind of a wasted spark ignition. Anyway, so that is the simplicity of this engine. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about, what makes this engine indestructible, is how it is easy to maintain. Very easy to maintain. Oil changes are a snap. You got your check engine, your oil check dipstick right here. You add it right there. The oil filter is very easy to get to underneath. It only holds about 4.5 quarts of oil, this engine, so it's very easy to maintain. Spark plugs. You don't have to worry about distributors or anything like that. You got your coil pack right here. You got 3 spark plugs up front here, which are pretty easy to get to. The more challenging ones are the spark plugs back on the back side of the engine here. On the Riviera, it's a little bit of a bigger engine bay, so it makes it a little bit easier to get to those back spark plugs, where I really don't have to do a lot to be able to get to those. Some engine bays are a little bit tighter, where the V6 is transversely mounted, and may be hard to get to those back spark plugs. But as far as maintenance goes, the EGR was so easy to replace. Everything's on the throttle body, easy to maintain. And the way this engine's built, it's just really reliable. Now, you may be like, what about later iterations of this engine? So, technically, they call this one pre-Series 1. I call it Series 1, and I call the one that was introduced in 1991 that was called tuned port injection, I would call that Series 1.5. Because all they did was they took the same engine and they added a different intake system, a 2-piece aluminum intake system that was actually tuned to actually help the engine actually breathe a little bit better and actually develop more low-end torque. Then in 1995 was a big change for the 3800, where everything was changed, and it came out with the Series 2. One of the downsides of the Series 2 engine that if you ever look for one of these engines you have to look out for is it had a 2-piece intake. Almost like the Series 1, except they went with a upper plastic and a lower aluminum. Because of that, and because for some reason GM loves to have coolant running through the throttle body. In fact, I've seen the video and I know why. They said it's to prevent the throttle body from freezing up is the reason why coolant runs through these throttle bodies. I don't buy it. But anyway, that's why they did it. So they did that in the Series 2 as well. Because coolant runs through the throttle body and part of the plastic intake system, where the plastic of the upper part of the intake meets the lower part of the aluminum, it likes to leak. So that's something to keep out for. Usually there's some updates that can be done. You can get a better intake, whatnot, that is, that won't be prone to warpage and better gasketing as well. And then they came out with the Series 3 in 2004. Again, they totally updated the engine as well, and they came out, you know, it's kind of funny, in the Series 3 V6 of this engine, the intake is still a two-piece, but they went back to the two-piece aluminum instead of the upper plastic and the lower aluminum. Anyway, so just a little background history of the 3800. One of the unique benefits about this engine is the gas mileage. One of the things, if you look at Motor Week. Motor Week is an awesome resource, and they have so many retro reviews. Every single older vehicle that runs this engine consistently on their testing always got 22 to 23 miles per gallon, combination of city and highway. When we drove this back from Montana over here to Post Falls, I was getting 31 miles per gallon in this thing. Unbelievable. I mean, it has 169,000 miles. And the engine probably is in need of a tune-up, but yet I was still getting 31 miles to the gallon. Again, pretty awesome out of a V6 that has decent power, decent acceleration, and very smooth for its time period. All right. If you have any questions, comments, please leave them down below. Love to hear about those. Love to communicate with you about those. And tune in. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. Hit the bell notification. I'm actually doing my first live video this Saturday at 6 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. You want to tune in. If you're living in a different time zone, adjust your time zone. Again, 6 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. I want to do my first teardown video of a small engine. I used to be a small engine mechanic. I did it for, going on 30 years. Ever since I graduated high school. I was pretty much, when I graduated high school, I went to a Vo-Tech school where I took small engine technology. You know, when I was even in high school, my senior year, I was working at a small engine shop and was doing it, you know, pretty much up until just recently. So, again, we're going to be tearing down a small engine. In fact, I'm going to grab a Honda small engine. We're going to tear into that. So you want to stay tuned for that. 6 o'clock, going live Saturday, Standard Pacific Time, or Pacific Standard Time. I'd love to see you guys tune in for that. Anyway, if you have any questions, comments, tell me your 3800 stories. Tell me what you think about the old 3800. I think it's an excellent engine, and there's a reason why my son drives a car powered by this power plant for his first vehicle. All right, you guys be blessed. Have a wonderful day. We'll catch you on the next one. Thank you.